Princes and Priests, Chapter 22, The River. The river didn't stay kind long. It turned into rapids within the first few days on the water. As the river began to drop out of the highlands toward the south, it seemed to go from one roaring tangle of rocks and waves into another. Panic and doubt turned into battered bodies and weary muscles, but with Dave yelling orders and Revan at the front, with his sharp dwarven eyes and instincts working for Dave, no one was lost, and they never once tipped the boats. The waves and spray of the river had them soaked the entire time. More than once the boat was so water-filled at the bottom of a run that they had to jump out to keep it from slowly sinking under them. They went from one horrible set of rapids to the next, and when they stopped, they sat with their heads hung low, feeling far worse and battered than ever before. Not even in the bog had they felt so tired, nor so cold and hungry, even on the highest mountain. No one mentioned it, but they all noticed it. At night they huddled close to small fires, trying to dry out for the next day. Dave had to study the water before they went on, and they all had to make certain there were no eyes to see them once they started. They made unsettlingly little distance, but they were able to avoid the patrols and hide well in the bushes along the river.
That was fun,
Revan laughed, after one particularly terrifying run.
You're sick,
Oirion said, white-faced and shaky.
Enjoy it, Oirion,
Revan chuckled, invigorated by the runs. He was dwarven and loved the excitement of wild things, mountains, rivers, and winds.
It keeps the heart pumping.
I was thinking it was rather heart-stopping,
Kaava said, agreeing with Oirion. His claws sunk into the side of the boat. They pulled the boats out of the current toward the bank to find a place where the brush leaned out into the water. The clouds were low and threatened to rain, but at least they were far enough south that there was no danger of snow. Kaava was not sure if they were still in Elven territory. None of the Ulamar had been this far south since before they were warped. The land was unknown here, but the companions needed to rest after each run, and Revan wanted to go hunting for food. They needed to eat soon. They were all feeling hungry and tired for it. Storms out of the north had been gusting south due to the effects of the battle magics, but at least they were not seeing bodies along the banks anymore. Tying up to the tree, Revan lightly hopped out and ducked off into the forest, while the others set to hiding themselves and the boats from anyone who passed by. They were still working on that as several patrol boats slipped past full of elves. The patrol boats were silent and far faster in the water than the group of weary companions were. The elves were looking for something. It was pure luck that the battered little group had decided to rest and was not on the river at that moment. As it was, they held as still as possible and prayed that the screen they had built was enough. Once the boats had passed, they all let out the breath they were holding and half smiled at each other, but it was a bit too tense to be forgotten quickly.
We have to stay more hidden,
Kelly breathed.
We are apparently still in Elven territory.
She lifted her eyes, actually speaking for once. They all knew she was still in pain, and the color had not returned to her face. Often the strain of getting through the rapids tore open her wounds and set her to bleeding again. She never complained, but she did not move beyond what was utterly necessary anymore.
I'm so tired of this,
Ivan muttered.
I feel like a rat in a step hut.
We all do,
Kelly said.
None of us are used to being beggars at a ball, but we'll get through if we just keep our heads. There will be fog tonight. We should move on then and conceal ourselves in the dark and mist.
What did you do before this nightmare?
Ivan asked her, desperate to talk about something and not think about elves. Kelly looked over at the big man.
I killed people,
she said, without a hint of a smile or jest.
There are a lot of ways to do that,
Ivan said, with heaviness to his voice.
So did I, but I doubt that we worked the same job.
I was a sailor,
Dave offered, to cover Kelly's silence on the matter.
We know that,
Ivan said.
And I'm an arena assassin, Oirion is a priest, and Revan is a cleric, right?
Oirion isn't just a priest, he is a hunter.
Revan corrected.
There is a vast difference. A priest who is just a priest does weddings and guides the people in their search for God. Hunters and clerics protect the people so that they remain alive to continue their search. He hunts vampires on the border of Norwood.
Even looked at Oirion.
You live in Norwood?
I live in Awins.
Oirion said.
I happen to work along the border of Norwood from Awins to Nye, on a circuit that a number of other partners also work.
So you're sort of used to all this.
Even said, glancing around.
The hunting, being hunted, the battle magics, the long nights, the warped places.
I hunt vampires and kill them. I deal very little with magic.
Oirion said.
Reven, however, is likely to be well in his element in this sort of world. He is just not accustomed to dealing with other people who require or desire his aid.
Reven grunted.
Pretty much. It does bother me, though, that so much of the magics here I am at a loss over. I didn't properly read the grasslands or the killer tree.
He scowled as things ran through his head.
I have been a cleric in the wilds for a long time, but have seen things here unlike anything I've heard of before.
But Shannon reads them.
Even said.
Shannon was a cleric too, and has lived far longer than I have.
Reven said.
You would believe that?
Oirion asked Reven. Reven looked to his fellow priest.
Yes, Oirion, I do believe that. I also believe he knows things that could destroy the church to its very roots. And while he doesn't like the current rule of the church, he knows its heart is true, and so says nothing, but is hunted for what he knows. Look around you. You and I are now on that list. We have seen priests side by side with zombies, and church armies massed to slaughter native people. That is not our God, not my God, and not what I gave my soul to be a part of.
Shannon might have been one once,
Oirion said.
but he isn't now, and we both know it.
I don't care.
Reven said.
I wish he was here. He has aided us through this madness and slowed his step to match ours.
I wonder what Theo did all day.
Dave mused.
While I was out in the wind throwing ropes and watching the sky, what did he do?
He chuckled.
You think he wrote poetry like any good court monkey?
No,
Even said.
I don't think Theo was a good monkey.
Why?
Oirion asked.
He certainly looks the part. He reminds me of my brothers, actually.
Court monkeys walk with their noses in the air.
Ivan made the suitable face, jutting his nose up.
They huff and pout like Cindy.
He offered.
But Theo flinches down, he looks away, he hides behind Dave so Shannon can't see him. Then he runs into a battle-wielding power that he shouldn't even have, and his eyes light up like a dwarven screamer.
He shook his head.
No, that one is no monkey.
What then?
Dave asked seriously. No one said anything.
Oirion,
Reven asked to the man's uneasy avoidance.
What?
what do you think?
There is a dark presence in Awins.
He said softly.
A fellow sixth spoke to us briefly regarding his fears that it came from the Queen. He and his partner were going to slip over to take a closer look, as it had to be learned of. He mentioned that someone high in the court was using and enforcing black magics. We had felt it as well, but trusted that the church would be dealing with it. I certainly don't think any less of the trouble now. If anything, I think it far worse than I might have ever believed before. If Theo was in that court and was known to possess a trace of sorceric power, he must have been an ill-guarded child in a very bad place. I cannot imagine that he would have been able to deal with that on his own.
He sighed heavily.
Much might have been blamed on him as a scapegoat. I expect he ran away, and that was why. I know Shannon said he was in his 60s, but I still find that hard to accept.
That's depressing.
Dave muttered.
What about Tavia?
He asked.
I have no idea what she did.
They all looked around at each other.
I don't think any of us do.
Even said.
She is a fine cook and does well with herbs. A midwife, perhaps.
She speaks at least 3 languages that I have heard.
Reven said.
She isn't afraid of Shannon.
Dave muttered.
Are we certain Travis is really her son?
Oirion asked. They all looked at him a bit shocked. He knew her best, they thought, and to ask that seemed odd.
Well,
Oirion asked.
Travis is not human and she is.
He's not human.
Dave asked.
No more than you are.
Oirion said.
What, a half-elven Purton is my guess. Mother an elf, Dave.
Yes, she was.
Dave said slowly.
Travis isn't human, so unless Tavia has worn such illusions as to hide herself as human despite whatever race she truly is, she isn't his mother.
Not all illusions are skin deep.
Kelly said.
How so?
Reven asked. Kelly looked around them as they sat together, huddled in the cold about the fire, injured, beaten, and desperate to get their minds off of this place. She drew a deep breath.
2,000 years before the birth of Tyrell von Armand, in the great deserts and jungle of Lowin, there ruled the goddess Raz. She was both terrible and beautiful, just as the desert can be. Like the desert, she is also very jealous. In those days, her people were scattered. Her priests were at odds with each other, bickering back and forth. The tribes of her kingdom were strewn about. Cities were left deserted. Sacrifices were not made. And she began to grow angry at her people. She stole their water away, and she made the women fail to have babies for decades. She drove the sheep to scatter and flee their shepherds. With her people in such a spread-out condition, the elves began to move in. They slipped up through the jungle. They stole into mines and took great gems and crystals. They raided temples and palaces. They butchered the jungle tribes. In that jungle, there was a tribe that lived along the banks of the great river. They were farmers who dwelt in the floodplains. The elves came upon them and set to slaughtering them. An old man who had come from the desert when he was young to marry the most beautiful woman of all the jungle tribes heard the battle and knew that he was too old to fight it. He pulled out his weapons, his desert trinkets, which he still kept sacred and safe, and gathered his young granddaughter into his arms. They fled the river and went up from the river's plains and into the wilds to get out of the area and away from the raiding elves. They waded through flooded groves, struggled through thick vegetation, crawled up rugged mountains, crossed raging rivers, and eventually came out of the jungle. He had returned to the desert. The man was old, though, and the trip was long and very hard for him. Along the way, he taught his granddaughter everything he knew. He taught her the ways of the swords and the prayers to his goddess. It was not long, however, until the desert heat stole his breath in a sandstorm and left the girl alone.
Kelly paused to take a drink. The companions waited.
Somehow she survived, but she was a young girl of the floodplains. She spent her days appealing to the goddess Raz to let her find a new home, to be worthy of life, to be strong enough to live in the desert, to honor her grandfather. She was found all right and taken by raiders. She was so young, yet as to not even have reached full womanhood, but old enough to know that she was not likely to be seen as a child. She was taken to a prince and thrown at his feet. Then, for the first time in her life, she learned that she was beautiful. The prince wanted her. He had her bathed in scented water. He had her hair oiled and strung with beads. He dressed her in the finest of the clothes that his tent tribe had to offer, and he had her brought to his bed. Now he was ugly. He was snarled with scars, wore tats on his face of the number of other tribes he had wiped out, and had one eye cast white by illness. She was not terrified then, but furious, like a chained cat. She would not be touched by such a thing. She took his own dagger and slashed him across the face before she fled.
Kelly took another sip of the rose-hip tea they had made for the night. The others waited in silence.
He got on his horse and chased her down, he and his men. They caught her in the desert, and there he pinned her down in front of his men and was about to slice her face, as she had done to him, but his son stepped in. "Why destroy such a thing?" he asked his father. "Like a fine wine, let us share it. Would that not punish her more? And should she have rise to a child of it, what a stunning slave it might make."
Stalling, Kelly took another sip of her cooling tea. She paused a while, as if she had forgotten her story, or might go no further, but they all waited for her.
She was forced to kneel in the sand while the prince stripped off his clothes. She still held her defiance. She glared at him in rage. "Should you do so, it is as if it was Raz," she shouted at them. "This is her body. Your punishment will be in accord."
Kelly looked around at them, letting the words sink in.
Of course he was not afraid, but laughed at her and forced himself on her. He was followed by his men, his sons, and his brothers. They drug her home and hung her by her wrists in the yard.
How does that relate to illusions?
Dave asked. Kelly didn't look up, but started again, as if she had been waiting for the question.
Kara Hesha, high priestess of Raz, was at war with the elven horde and their gods. She knew that the elves were divided into houses, and that many of them were at war with each other. She thought that she could turn the two strongest houses against one another, so she put herself into the role of being a mere guard. There, in the dungeon prison, she saw an elven man whom she recognized as a minor prince of the other house. She meant to play him, to make him think that this house had betrayed his. She purposefully let him overhear false information that this house was secretly funding another rival house. Then she let him escape. As she had hoped, the houses turned on each other, and the war took a great step forward. Years later, far up the coast, she stood atop the cliffs, waiting to watch an elven battle. Unexpectedly, she saw that same man sneaking along the cliff line, attempting to slip around behind the other army. He stopped, stunned to see her, yet she did nothing. He went on his way and disappeared down the other side. She watched the battle into the night and then settled down to make tea, waiting for dawn and the aftermath. He came back. He dared to enter her firelight and asked to sit with her. He told her of the war, of the elves, and offered to aid her for letting him go. He knew that he had escaped far too easily. She accepted.
Kelly took a sip of tea and held the cup in her hands, looking at it a long time.
He was skilled, he was stunning, and he was powerful in magics and war. He fought beside her, aided her, and used her armies against his enemies. Raz is a jealous goddess, and she warned her priestess to beware of such things. She was told to not take the man. For years, such warning held, but it eventually slipped her, and she took the elf to be her lover. It was years later that he learned who she really was. He had thought her a mere member of the army, but had no idea it was she who ruled. His plans went from dark to vile, from heartless to torturous. He had set her up from the very beginning, and he betrayed her. He had used her army to conquer smaller houses, capture their warriors as slaves, and had massed a great army of his own. He used her lands to stage his own war on the empire, but he needed one last thing to get what he desired, and she provided it. He drugged her and took her to the cliff top. There he apologized to her, but then offered her pain up to his god and made her watch as his army betrayed hers and wiped them out. Her tears brought him great power. She was left on the top of the cliff. In rage, her goddess came cold and bitter. She transformed her priestess into an elf, a true transformation, not an illusion. So when the last of her own men came and found that the elves had betrayed them, there was but one left to punish. Punish her they did. They left her bound to a pole on the cliff top. So, for the second time in her life, she was left naked, beaten, raped, and broken. She hung there, weeping for death, her army and her heart betrayed. Raz came to her and pointed out what her little love affair had cost. Kara spoke back, demanding to know why she was allowed to be drugged, why the goddess allowed it to happen. Simply out of jealousy? To teach her daughter a lesson. The goddess blamed it all on her priestess, and to further punish her, she stripped away everything. She turned the priestess into a brutish creature, so hideous that she might never be loved or touched again by any but Raz.
Kelly looked around at them.
This was not an illusion either, but another true transformation. Different race, different energy, different voice. There are other cases of such, normally for great reason, and the cost in power is so high, gods have fallen out of their divine state for the price. Such a transformation is a massive task, but in the land of the humans of Malkut, it is said that the witches there can change their race and form, even becoming trees or boulders. That part of their rank, from beginner into the higher levels, requires 100 years in another form. That is why the other races have never been able to kill them out. They become rocks or trees, and armies walk right past. Do not think that what you see defines who a person is.
Soul also transcends form.
Dave said.
Life to life, we can shift races. Race does not define the soul.
No,
Ravon agreed.
but the habits and personality of the soul will choose a race that fits with them. It's hard for the soul to stay within the form of a race that it's not compatible with. It results in stillbirth, more often than not.
That is also to say that races should not mix.
Dave said.
I do not find conflict in myself over race. I am what I am.
Ah, yes.
Stephen said with a grin.
You are what you are, but my friend, where else in this world would you feel that way but on the waters or in such a mixed group?
How many races do we have?
Ravon asked, as if thinking about it for the first time.
We have a dwarf, an Eziran, a Pertan half-elf, an Arwens, 2 humans, a Sphinx, an Ulam-Ar, and whatever Travis is, and human for Tavia if that is what she is. You are human, aren't you, Oirion?
More or less, but my grandfather is Pertan.
Don't forget Shannon. He is as Pertan gets.
Kelly said softly.
That's a pretty diverse group.
Ivan explained to Dave.
We are all exiles together, just as pirates are.
True, I guess.
Dave said.
But I have no intention of ever being anything else, so it doesn't cause me any conflict.
It might someday.
Kelly said.
Race can get in the way of many things.
He shrugged.
Gods are like race, they can change life to life, and a life can change through a lot of ways, not just death.
Ivan grunted.
Depends on the god, I guess.
Crouching low, Raven pushed the boughs out of the way to see what was before him. This was not good. Beyond a sweep of field, there was the last thing he had wanted to see. It was an elven city, the red onion domes and spiraled towers, the golden spires, and the walls carved with the reliefs of trees. It was the same as any elven design he had seen. The elements were a bit different here, but similar enough that it could have been a city anywhere in the world. It was not just that he saw the city, but around it was an army encampment. Patrols moved along the border of the camps, and the walls showed signs of war. He was dangerously close. There was not going to be any game to snag here, and he did not trust his magics well enough to sneak in and steal something. They would have to move on quickly and try to get downriver and beyond the city. He turned to go back. Noticing the elf too late, his movement got him spotted, and even as he turned to escape, he had 3 elves on him with their bows pulled back and ready to shoot. Raven put up his hands, as if in surrender. Then he dropped as he shouted. Vapors swirled up and around him as he rolled hard to escape the area. Once clear, he ran for the river while the elves tried to banish the smoke. As he ran, Raven grabbed up a boulder and flung it into the river to make a splash before he dropped down on the bank, pulling all his skill into hiding himself as the elves ran up not far behind him. He prayed they would not know his magics. They stopped at the river's edge and used scans to try to find him in the water. One shot an arrow and then got a hand on his arm to stop him from shooting another. They split up. Half went upstream, while the other half went downstream. They went right past the boats and the dwarf, who was looking somewhat like a log washed up on the rather high bank. The elves did not seem to notice either, as they moved quickly and silently, searching for the escaped dwarf. Once they had passed, Raven scurried back to the makeshift rest site just as it began to rain. He slid into the boat with his heart pounding.
We are right at a city,
he said.
What did it look like?
Kava asked.
Like an elven city, big towers, onion domes, and...
Did it have evenly spaced towers, or were they in groups?
Taking a moment, Raven paused to think.
There were 2 great towers near the north end of the city as far as I could see, and there was a gate. It has taken war damage. The top of the gate appears to have been cut to outline the domes, and 3 towers lined up just beyond the gate.
Kava snarled.
What?
Ivan asked.
It sounds like Zensha. That means we are barely into the elven territory at all. I had hoped we came ashore farther down than this. We have a very long way to go.
The mist will rise soon.
Kelly said wearily.
It is best we put to the river now and use it to hide ourselves.
They all had to agree, even though none of them liked the idea of no food for another day. Theo didn't realize how little he and Shannon spoke to each other until they were alone. They went all day without a word, and that evening, Theo said nothing as he walked off to use the trees while Shannon set up camp. He returned and found the camp with 2 tents, a fire going, and tea almost ready. Theo took a place on the tarp, legs folded, his warm robe and cloak wrapped around him. Digging in the pack, he pulled out his little book and pencils. Although he did not have the light to draw well, he made a quick sketch of a mandala that had been on his mind for most of the day. He had once known a guard who taught him to draw mandalas to get his mind off his fears. That little game had given him a great boost in the idea and understanding of summons rings and demon wards. It was energy, of one sort or another, put on a surface to be seen and touched. The purpose of this mandala was to draw forth the energy that he wished to influence, and at the same time, to get rid of what he didn't want. What Shannon had said about a child being forced to use dark magic was going through his head, making him rethink things from an outside angle. He also had a lot to think about regarding the shields that he had not considered in decades. The storms that continued to blow in made his thoughts even more scattered, spinning with the magics of his childhood. As if the thought of it had manifested into reality, he was no longer in his own tent, but instead in the tent of the shaman of the plains. He was aware of himself still sketching at the fire, and it was as if he was dreaming of the shaman's tent. He could hear the drums and smell the unusual fire and smoke. It was as if he was part of a ceremony that was happening right then. He felt very much as if he was in two places at once. Across from him sat Travis, little Travis, naked like the rest of them. They were all painted, but not in the bold, wild, dark colors of battle. These were blues and greens, drawn into the shapes of vines and spell lines of healing power. Travis looked up at him and smiled. Then Theo stood on the windswept hills of the plains, the battle having torn it apart. The drumming and song were an attempt to heal the damage. However, it was not their battlefield he stood on, but another. He could see mountains to the west, not the east, and the land rolled more here. The ruins of a castle smoldered on the hillside where a road had once run up toward a pass. He could see it, sheer stone cliffs offering a way through to the north. There was a terrible deep silence and an utter lack of people. He stood alone in the wind.
What happened?
He asked.
It is not an event.
Theo turned to see a man who had suddenly appeared at his side. He was old, with long white hair, and his eyes were a pale blue, like a winter sky, and had no pupils to them at all. He wore a long robe, perhaps white at one time, perhaps a bishop's robe. It was so travel-stained and worn that it was gray, the hem soot-stained and muddy. The figure was nearly transparent, as if in between two different realms.
Who are you? Where is this?
The old man smiled faintly.
Oh, I do not say my name any more. To the world I am gone, and better it be thought as much. My castles are in ruins and my armies are shattered.
He smiled sadly.
As to where this is, it is the sanctuary of one who allows me to be here. He is here as well at times, but his mind fades. He will not be here much longer, and when he goes, so too will my hiding place.
Who is he?
That is not something you need to know right now.
The translucent guide sighed as he watched the castle burn.
So you will tell me nothing? Why am I here then?
The shamans pray for you,
he said, with a little hint of a smile.
Why?
They know what evil you will face. They have seen the shadow of the days to come, and so you are brought here. Come, someone would wish to meet you.
He led the way through the shattered field to the ruined castle. The walls were broken and crumbling, the floor blood-stained, the statues smashed. Gardens had been burnt, and wood still burned and smoldered. They entered a chamber where a man sat alone, bent in his chair, grief weighing him down.
Tai,
the old man said softly. The one in the chair then stirred and lifted his head slowly, as if the mere effort was all he could summon up anymore. He had been weeping, and tears had dried to his face. His hair was disheveled, his beard nearly white, pressed outward from his head long bent. He wore his crown, tarnished and broken, but still on his brow. Theo nearly choked. He knew at once who it was. He went across the floor and dropped to a knee before the Emperor of Pert.
Who is this?
The old emperor asked of the guide.
It is Tharadon Lords, heir of Aewins.
The old man reached out and lifted Theo's face.
Tharadon Lords?
He whispered the name.
Pert still lives?
Theo could not even think to talk. He was in the sanctuary of the father of Shannon. What could he hope to say?
My son,
Tyrell asked.
As I have told you,
the guide said to the shadow of the soul of the Emperor Tyrell, putting a hand on Theo's shoulder to interrupt his response.
Your son yet fights for his soul. He has not given up.
The aged emperor looked up to the guide.
I failed him. I betrayed his trust. It is my fault.
That is not a matter for now. Look upon the face of one who walks with your son even now.
The man looked back to Theo. Theo wanted to cry for the pain in the man's eyes. He wanted to ask where he was, how he still lived. He had so many questions, but could not manage to do more than breathe. Tyrell rose from his little wooden chair and stood before Theo, shaky at first, but growing in strength.
"If there is yet hope, then I shall fight for it,"
he said, his voice stronger.
"As in the age before, the war pivoted on the hands of the King of Arwens, so it may be again."
Theo looked up from tears that were blurring his eyes to see the man transformed. He stood in stunning robes of red and gold. His crown almost glowed. He lifted his hands, holding a crown with his fingertips.
"In the witness of Armand, in the presence of the souls that yet linger with me, I declare to the entire world and all the realms that Tharadon Lords is to be king of all Arwens, with all the power and honor due him."
Before Theo could object, the man set the crown on Theo's head. Theo was pulled to his feet by the guide, unable to look away from the Emperor. Theo wanted to ask, to speak, but couldn't. He just stood looking, the face burning into his memory. The Emperor touched his cheek.
"It is not much, but it is what I can give you. I wish I had more."
"I walked away from Arwen's. It's a war I can't win,"
Theo responded, finding his voice.
"Alone, no,"
the old man agreed.
"But right now, you are not alone. Now the angels of Pert might aid you. Now the wells of Pert can be summoned up to your hands. Now you can open the gates to more kings and crown them in my name. For you I make regent in my absence."
"Oh, please don't,"
Theo whispered, terrified of the power and of the chance Jerome would get hold of him. Was this not exactly what Jerome wanted?
"Please."
Tyrell laid his hand on Theo's head.
"In my stead, for you cannot possibly do worse than I have done. I would pray to all holy, all good, and all gods to aid you, and so perhaps redeem my wrong and heal the damage done. Might my son forgive me for my weakness and see my repentance in your deeds. Blessed be you, King of Aewons, Grand Lord of Pert."
The Emperor bowed, and Theo once again stood on the battlefield with the guide, far from the castle. He was weeping, terrified of what had happened. He could hear the drums of the shaman and feel the pencil in his hand. Theo wiped his eyes to look at the translucent figure that stood with him. He thought for a split moment that it might have been the same one who had brought him the gift of the egg. They had the same eyes, and it seemed as if he knew him. Then the kind smile made the feeling slip away.
"Go quickly, Tharadon. Trust that you are king, and that you hold every right to be honored and respected. Whatever power of Pert can reach you will be there to aid you. Shannon will defend you, but so too must you defend and guard him. He must return to Pert at all costs."
Theo was back at the campfire, tears streaming down his face, the drums slowly fading out of his mind. He closed the book, his hand having gone still. Tucking it away, he curled up, glad that Shannon wasn't in camp. He would fake sleep if the man got back before he truly was. What a horrible dream. What an utter manifestation of his fears. He pulled the blanket up over his head. Shannon watched him from the shadows. Nothing had seemed to happen. The delicate man had sat and sketched for hours, power radiating off of the paper to the point that Shannon had to shield it to prevent alerting the many powers that hovered far too close. Theo had begun to weep, and then curled up without any word or sign of what had truly transpired. Shannon had never spent much time with any of the Lord's family, but if that was how they all acted, it was no wonder the joke of Pert had been that crazy was the true mark of the rightful King of Aewons. But if Theo could take the throne, then Shannon would find a way to bring the barrier shield of Norwood down around the smaller kingdom and keep Jerome from getting his hands on the rightful king. Shannon knew well before they got within sight of the city that it was under siege. They had to get past it. Standing side by side, Shannon and Theo looked out over the crushed vineyards, from their vantage at the hilltop, toward the city. The river was somewhere on the far side. They could see everything from up here. The city was massive and stretched as far as one could see, with spires and walls towering up over the army that had gathered about its base. Still, being able to see it all didn't help them get around it.
"Can we go around?"
Theo asked.
The others are here, and they are dangerously close to the city. If we take the time to go around, we may risk losing track of them.
Shannon stood with his hands on his hips.
It will be difficult for them to get past. If by any chance they are taken inside the city, they could either be sold as slaves and sent somewhere else, or killed. We cannot see the far side, and the river might run right against the walls, allowing the elves inside the city to come and go. Our friends could be inside already.
You can't tell.
Not without risking detection. There is a shield over the city. Once we are closer, I might be able to see if they have been taken inside, but I cannot be certain if they are there now or not.
Well, if they aren't already in the city, the war will help the elves be distracted. What's it about, do you know?
Power,
Shannon guessed.
War is always about power.
Well, I meant that if one side was with Jerome and the other wasn't, we could give the not side a bit of power and maybe make his life harder.
You enjoy pissing him off?
Shannon asked, speaking in an uncharacteristically casual manner for the first time, as he looked over at Theo.
I suppose I do,
Theo admitted.
Get my jabs while I can, don't you?
No. I would rather he had no idea where I am at all. I hate it when he knows what country I'm in, let alone within a few hundred miles. It makes me very nervous.
I don't think he knows I'm here yet.
He knows I'm here. Right now, he knows I'm within a few hundred miles of the city and moving southwest. Of that I'm certain,
Shannon said.
Right, well, it was just an idea.
It has merit, though. If there is an open battle, we can get in much closer.
Closer? I don't want closer. I want our friends and to get away.
I guess we hide out for a day or two and see if they move south or west at all.
Shannon stood watching the army for a bit, while Theo pulled out a canteen, wishing for wine over the stale-tasting water.
They are his,
Shannon said.
What?
Theo asked, walking back to Shannon's side.
They are Jerome's.
There.
Shannon pointed.
Clerics, they just came in from patrol.
He's been known to play both sides, but at least we know who they are afraid of.
Shannon nodded and turned away.
We all need to be out of this area as fast as possible. We cannot do what we did with the nomads.
As if to drive his point home, dark clouds began to roll over and block the sun, flickering with lightning of an unnatural sort. The storms of the north were following them. Nothing about the day had been good. One of the boats had hit a boulder, gouging a hole into the bottom of the hull. It was taking on a lot of water, and everyone was blaming the other for it. They had no food, and the rain had soaked everything. Making it all worse, as they argued with each other while struggling with the boats to get them up out of the river and onto the bank, one of the boats balked and hit Oirion hard, driving him under. Kelly managed to get hold of him and hauled him up, but they lost hold of the boat. It swung around and hit the bank hard enough that the seams of its already damaged body were popped. It took all the strength they had left to keep the half-full boat from being drug away by the current. Once on the bank, Oirion dropped down on the rocks, his legs still in the ice-cold water. He held his head, spitting blood into the river, as the others worked to get the boat up and out of sight. Kava took off to go hunting, while Kelly set to hiding the path up from the river. They had no idea where they were, but elven patrols had begun to happen far more often, so they had no illusion of being free from the danger of being caught. Patrols would notice such an obvious mark as a broken boat on the bank.
Get out of the water,
Kelly told Oirion once she had reached the river's edge. Oirion spit more blood and did not move.
Oirion,
She pressed.
you'll get sick. Get out of the water.
Doesn't matter.
He said. She grabbed him and jerked him up out of the water and to his feet. He gasped in pain and grabbed his side where his ribs were snapped. It wasn't his lips that were bleeding as she had thought. He was white-faced and there was blood in his beard and on his nose. He coughed and spat up more.
Damn!
She swore and pointed.
Camp now.
There's not much you can hope to do. We have no healers,
He said with a sad sort of acceptance.
I said move.
She said to Oirion and pointed again. He trudged up the trail to where Even and Ravan were arguing about how to fix the boat.
We have a problem.
Kelly said. Neither one of them heard her, as they argued about either repairing it as it was or tearing it apart to fix it properly. She grabbed Ivan and jerked him around. He swung at her on instinct, but was quickly slammed down to the ground with a blast of power he had not felt before. She stood over the panting and stunned Ivan. The fighting stopped, and for the first time, Kelly took charge of the exhausted company.
I said we have a problem.
We have a hole in the boat, no food and no repair tools. What could be worse?
Dave asked, while hanging their blankets up to drip in the rain.
Oirion has a punctured lung. He's dying,
she said. Raven and Ivan fell silent, and Dave turned from his task to look at Oirion, who was sinking to the ground with a very white face. Kava ducked back into camp low and fast.
Hunters in the forest, they are close.
Now what?
Dave asked, his voice thick with contempt at the impossible nature of the day's events.
Where?
Oirion asked, getting back up. Kava pointed back up the way he had come. Oirion turned and ran in that direction. Dave moved to get hold of him, to stop him, but Kelly grabbed his arm.
He's got an injury that we can't fix,
she said. Ivan looked at them all for a split moment, and with a speed that startled them, moved and raced after Oirion. Raven considered a moment, then motioned for the others to move in the opposite direction of Oirion and the patrol.
Let's hide until dark, see if the boat is found, and then we decide what to do. We all need the rest. We can't stop Oirion and Ivan now, and they have bought us a chance. Don't ruin it.
They never even saw Oirion coming, and while they might not have been a patrol, they were a threat to the others. He would kill as many as he could to give the others a chance to get away. He ripped an elf off of his saddle, crushed his face with an elbow, and then turned and blasted another clear of his horse with a bolt of power. He was a hunter, and for once, he was going to unleash the power he reserved only for vampires. The elves only then began to move. He took out 3 more before Ivan got there, and a 4th as Ivan reached his side. They moved and fought together at that point, quickly eliminating the little group. As the horses scattered, Oirion leaned on his sword to cough up blood. He lifted his gaze to Ivan.
What the hell are you doing?
Oirion demanded of Ivan, just as another group of elves appeared out of the trees, mounted on horses and armed with swords and bows. Oirion didn't even bother to straighten at all. Ivan jerked his helm off and threw it aside before he charged the closest horse with a roar. There was no escape, and both men knew it. Ivan was out to just see how many he could take down before the end. Oirion joined his friend to see if he might allow Ivan a few more kills. They were both great fighters, but were far outnumbered. They had far too many days without food, were chilled to the bone, and Oirion was seriously injured. Even so, they took a stance together and moved to fight as if they had been brothers and had fought together all their lives. The elves were not prepared, nor trained, for such skill, and for one moment, Ivan truly thought they might win. But then, a dart struck his leg. The elven fighters fell back at once. He looked down at the tasseled shaft a moment, and then looked at Oirion, who had one in his arm. Oirion swore under his breath as he tried to look at Ivan, but his eyes were already rolling as he crumpled to the ground. Ivan dropped heavily to a knee as he felt his body begin to go numb.
And that is how we deal with animals,
a high-ranking elf said. Darkness slowly overtook Ivan as the elves began to clean up the battle site.
Thank you for listening, but please keep in mind clicking on those like and subscribe buttons makes it possible for us to continue sharing content with you.